The morning mist clung to the Pennsylvania countryside like a shroud, obscuring the rolling hills and farmland that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. In this peaceful corner of Lancaster County, where time seemed to move at the pace of horse-drawn buggies and the rhythm of seasons, Ezra Miller stood at his kitchen window, staring out at fields that should have been harvested weeks ago. At 45, Ezra's once powerful frame had grown lean from neglect rather than hard work. His dark beard, streaked with premature gray, hung unkempt against his chest. The traditional black suspenders that held up his plain brown trousers seemed loose on his diminished frame. His calloused hands, which had once worked the land with pride and purpose, now trembled slightly as he held a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. The silence in the house was deafening. 5 years had passed since Sarah's death. 5 years since that terrible day when complications during childbirth had taken both his wife and their unborn son. The community had rallied around him then, as Amish communities do, bringing food, offering help with the farm, providing the quiet comfort that comes from shared faith and mutual support. But as months turned to years, life had moved on for everyone except Ezra. His neighbors still checked on him, still invited him to barn raisings and community meals, but Ezra had gradually withdrawn from the life he once knew. The farm, which had been passed down through 3 generations of Miller men, now bore the signs of his neglect. Fences sagged, paint peeled from the barn, and weeds choked the vegetable garden that Sarah had tended with such love. A sharp knock at the kitchen door startled him from his reverie. Through the glass he could see his neighbor, Jacob Yoder, standing on the porch with his hat in his hands, his weathered face creased with concern. "Morning, Ezra," Jacob said as the door opened. "Thought I'd stop by and see how you're faring." Ezra stepped aside to let his old friend enter. Jacob was everything Ezra used to be, robust, energetic, with the satisfied look of a man whose life followed the natural order of things. His farm prospered, his children were healthy and growing, and his wife Martha still hummed while she worked in her kitchen. "I'm managing well enough," Ezra replied, though both men knew it wasn't true. Jacob's eyes swept the kitchen, taking in the unwashed dishes, the bare pantry shelves, the general air of abandonment that had settled over the house like dust. "The district is concerned about you, Ezra. Bishop Hustetler asked me to speak with you about the winter preparations." "Your fields?" "My fields are my concern," Ezra interrupted, a flash of his old stubbornness showing through. "I'll tend to them when I'm ready." "Brother, it's nearly November. The corn should have been harvested in September. The winter wheat should be in the ground. If you don't prepare now, you'll have nothing come spring." Jacob's voice was gentle but firm. "We've offered to help, time and again. Pride is a sin, Ezra, but so is sloth. Sarah wouldn't want this for you." At the mention of his wife's name, Ezra's jaw tightened. "Don't speak of what Sarah would want. You don't know. I know she loved you enough to want you to live, not just exist." Jacob placed his hat on the table and fixed Ezra with a steady gaze. "The community has decided. Tomorrow we're coming to help with the harvest, whether you want us to or not. It's not charity, it's what neighbors do." Before Ezra could protest, Jacob had picked up his hat and was heading for the door. "Be ready at dawn. And Ezra, put on some weight. You look like a scarecrow." Alone again, Ezra sank into a chair at the kitchen table, where he and Sarah used to share their morning coffee and plan their days. The silence pressed in around him, broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock that had been Sarah's grandmother's. He closed his eyes and tried to remember the sound of her laughter, but it seemed to fade a little more each day, like a melody played too softly to hear. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending leaves skittering across the yard. Storm clouds were building on the horizon, threatening rain. Ezra knew he should check on the animals, make sure the barn was secure, but the motivation to move seemed beyond him. Everything seemed beyond him these days. It was then that he heard it, a different sound cutting through the whistle of the wind. A voice, weak and desperate, calling out. At first, He thought it might be his imagination, another trick his lonely mind had begun to play on him. But there it was again, clearer this time. "Please, someone, help." Ezra rose slowly and moved to the window. Through the gathering gloom, he could see a figure near the edge of his property, close to where the dirt road met his lane. Someone was lying on the ground, partially hidden by the tall grass that he should have cut months ago. His first instinct was to ignore it. He'd had his fill of people trying to help him, and he certainly wasn't in any condition to help anyone else. But the voice came again, weaker now, almost lost in the wind, and something deep inside him, some remnant the man he used to be, stirred to life. Grabbing his coat from the peg by the door, Ezra stepped out into the cold morning air. The wind immediately cut through his thin frame, reminding him how much weight he'd lost over the years. His boots crunched on the frost-covered grass as he made his way toward the sound. What he found there would haunt him for the rest of his life. A young woman lay curled on her side near his mailbox, her body shaking with cold and exhaustion. She was severely overweight, her curls dirty and torn, her dark hair matted and unkempt. Her face was swollen, whether from crying or malnutrition, he couldn't tell, and her breathing was shallow and labored. She looked up at him with eyes that held the same hollow desperation he saw in his own mirror each morning, eyes that had seen too much pain, lost too much hope. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "I haven't eaten in 3 days. I don't want to die like this." For a moment, Ezra stood frozen, staring down at this broken creature who had somehow found her way to his broken life. His immediate reaction was one of revulsion and judgment. She was clearly not from their community. Her clothes, though dirty, were worldly. Her size suggested a lifetime of excess and poor choices. She represented everything that his ordered, disciplined world stood against. "You can't stay here," he said, his voice harsher than he intended. "This is private property. Move along." The woman tried to push herself up, but her strength failed her, and she collapsed back to the ground. "I'm sorry," she gasped. "I was walking, got lost. So tired. There's a town 5 miles down the road. They have services for people like you." Ezra turned to go, but her voice stopped him. "People like me?" There was a note of bitter understanding in her tone. "You mean fat? Worthless? I know what I look like. I know what people think when they see me." Despite himself, Ezra turned back. There was something in her voice, a depth of pain that resonated with his own, but he pushed the feeling away. He had enough problems without taking on someone else's. "I can't help you," he said. "I can barely help myself." "I'm not asking for much," she pleaded. "Just maybe some water, a piece of bread. I'll leave right after, I promise. I won't cause any trouble." The wind gusted again, sending a chill through both of them. The woman's lips were turning blue, and Ezra could see that she was on the verge of collapse. In the distance he could hear the rumble of thunder. The storm was coming fast. Every instinct told him to walk away, to go back to his empty house and let someone else deal with this problem. But as he looked down at her, something Sarah used to say echoed in his memory: "We're all just broken people trying to find our way home." Against his better judgment, against every wall he'd built around his heart, Ezra found himself bending down and grasping the woman's arm. "Can you walk?" She nodded weakly and allowed him to help her to her feet. She was heavier than he expected, and in his weakened state, he struggled to support her weight. Together, they made their slow way up the lane toward the house, the first drops of rain beginning to fall. "What's your name?" he asked, as they reached the porch. "Rebecca," she answered, breathing heavily from the short walk. "Rebecca Nash. I'm Ezra Miller. This is my farm." He hesitated at the door, still not sure he was doing the right thing. "You can come in until the storm passes, but then you'll need to move on. I don't have room in my life for complications." Rebecca nodded, too exhausted and grateful to argue. As Ezra opened the door and helped her inside, neither of them realized that this moment, this single act of reluctant compassion, would change both their lives forever. The kitchen felt different with another person in it, smaller somehow, but also more alive. Rebecca stood dripping on the linoleum floor, taking in her surroundings with the careful attention of someone who had learned not to take shelter for granted. "Sit," Ezra commanded, pointing to a chair at the table. "I'll get you some water." As he moved to the sink, he was acutely aware of how the house must look to a stranger. The dust, the disorder, the signs of a life half-lived. Sarah would have been mortified to have a guest see their home in such a state. She had always kept everything spotless, welcoming, ready for the unexpected visitor that was so common in Amish communities. He filled a glass with water and set it in front of Rebecca, who drank it in great, desperate gulps. Her hands, he noticed, were surprisingly clean despite her overall condition, and she held the glass carefully, as if afraid it might disappear. "Thank you," she said when she had finished. "You don't know what this means to me." Ezra grunted and turned away, uncomfortable with her gratitude. He opened the refrigerator and stared at its sparse contents, some leftover chicken soup that Jacob's wife had brought over the week before, a few apples, some cheese that was probably too old to be safe. It wasn't much, but it was more than Rebecca had. Without speaking, he ladled soup into a bowl and heated it on the stove. The simple act of preparing food for another person felt strange after so many years of eating alone, mechanically without pleasure or purpose. "I should tell you," Rebecca said quietly, "I understand if you're afraid I'll steal something or cause trouble. People usually are when they look at me. I know I don't look like much." "It's not that," Ezra replied, though he wasn't entirely sure what it was. I don't have visitors. Haven't for a long time." The soup was warm now, and he set it in front of her, along with a piece of bread he found in the pantry. Rebecca stared at the food for a moment, and he thought he saw tears in her eyes. "I haven't had a hot meal in," she paused, calculating, 2 weeks, maybe more. As she began to eat, slowly and carefully as if savoring every spoonful, Ezra found himself studying her more closely. Beneath the grime and the weight and the obvious signs of hard living, he could see traces of the woman she might have been. Her eyes, when they weren't clouded with exhaustion, were a deep blue-green. Her hands, despite their softness, moved with a certain grace. There was intelligence in her face, and something else, a sadness that seemed to match his own. "How did you end up here?" he asked, surprising himself with the question. Rebecca paused in her eating and looked up at him. "It's a long story, not a very interesting one. I'm not going anywhere." She smiled then, the first real smile he'd seen from her, and it transformed her face completely. For just a moment, she looked younger, lighter, as if the weight she carried wasn't just physical. "I used to have a different life," she began slowly. "A job, an apartment, people who cared about me. I worked at a children's hospital in Philadelphia. I was a nurse. I loved that job, loved those kids. But then," she trailed off, staring into her soup. "What happened? My mother got sick, cancer. I took care of her for 2 years, used up all my savings, all my sick leave, lost my job eventually. When she died, I couldn't afford the apartment anymore, couldn't find work without references. Everything just fell apart." Ezra listened in silence, recognizing the familiar pattern of loss and despair. "That was 3 years ago. 3 years, 4 months, and 16 days. Rebecca's precision was heartbreaking. "I've been on the streets ever since. Shelters when I could get in, under bridges when I couldn't. You learn to survive, but you never learn to live." The rain was coming down harder now, drumming against the windows with increasing intensity. Thunder rumbled overhead, and lightning briefly illuminated the kitchen in stark white light. "Why here?" Ezra asked. "This road doesn't lead anywhere important. I was trying to get to Lancaster. Someone at the last shelter said there might be work there, cleaning houses or something, but I got lost, and then it got dark. And then she gestured weakly at her current state. I just couldn't go any further. Another long silence fell between them, broken only by the sounds of the storm and Rebecca's careful eating. When she finished the soup, she sat back with a sigh of contentment that struck Ezra as profoundly sad, that such a small thing as a bowl of soup could bring such relief. I should go, she said, though she made no move to rise. The storm will pass eventually, and you said, stay until morning, Ezra heard himself say. The storm's getting worse and you're in no condition to travel. Rebecca's eyes widened in surprise. Are you sure? I don't want to impose. You can sleep on the couch. But tomorrow, you'll need to move on. I can't. He struggled for words. This isn't permanent. I understand. And thank you. Truly. As if to emphasize his point, a tremendous crash of thunder shook the house, followed immediately by a lightning flash that lit up the entire sky. Both of them jumped, and for a moment their eyes met across the table. In that instant something passed between them, an understanding perhaps, or a recognition. Two broken people, each carrying wounds that wouldn't heal, each having given up on the possibility of wholeness. Neither could save the other, but maybe, just maybe, they could offer a moment's respite from the loneliness that had become their constant companion. There are blankets in the closet by the stairs, Ezra said, breaking the spell. And the bathroom is just down the hall. Help yourself to whatever you need. Thank you, Rebecca said again, and the sincerity in her voice made Ezra's chest tighten with an emotion he'd thought long dead. As the storm raged outside and Rebecca settled herself on the couch, Ezra climbed the stairs to his empty bedroom. For the first time in 5 years, he wasn't the only living soul in the house. The knowledge should have been comforting, but instead it filled him with a restless anxiety. He lay in his bed, listening to the storm and the subtle sounds of another person moving about downstairs. Tomorrow she would leave, and he would return to his solitary existence. It would be better that way, he told himself. Safer, less complicated. But as sleep finally claimed him, Ezra Miller found himself hoping that tomorrow would be a long time coming. Ezra woke before dawn, as he had every day for the past 5 years. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind the clean, fresh smell of rain-washed earth and the gentle drip of water from the eaves. For a moment, lying in the darkness of his bedroom, he almost forgot about his unexpected guest. Then he heard it, the soft sound of someone moving carefully about his kitchen, trying not to make noise. He dressed quickly in his usual plain clothes and made his way downstairs, unsure of what he would find. The scene that greeted him stopped him in his tracks. Rebecca stood at his sink, washing the dishes that had been piling up for weeks. She had somehow managed to clean herself up during the night. Her hair was damp and neatly braided, her face scrubbed clean, revealing features that were actually quite pretty beneath the exhaustion and weight. She wore the same clothes as yesterday, but they looked fresher somehow, as if she had done her best to make herself presentable. The kitchen itself was transformed. Not only were the dishes clean and put away, but she had swept the floor, wiped down the counters, and even organized the scattered papers and tools that had been cluttering the table. The morning sun streaming through the now spotless windows revealed a room that looked more like the home Sarah had kept than the neglected space it had become. You didn't have to do this, Ezra said, his voice rougher than usual. Rebecca turned, startled. A flush of embarrassment colored her cheeks. I'm sorry, I woke up early and couldn't get back to sleep, and I wanted to do something to thank you for your kindness. I hope you don't mind. I told you that you could leave in the morning. The words came out harsher than he intended, but Rebecca's presence in his space, her presumption in touching his things, stirred something defensive in him. I know, and I will. I just thought. She trailed off, her face falling. I'm sorry. I overstepped. I'll go now. She moved toward the door with surprising dignity, her head held high despite the obvious hurt in her eyes. Something about her composure, the way she accepted his rejection without argument or pleading, made Ezra feel smaller than he had in years. Wait, he called out as she reached for the door handle. Have you eaten? Rebecca paused, her hand on the door. I found some oatmeal in your pantry. I made enough for two, in case, but I can leave it for you." Despite himself, Ezra's stomach growled at the mention of food. He couldn't remember the last time he'd had a proper breakfast, or any meal that hadn't come from a can or his neighbor's charity. "I suppose I could eat something." Relief flickered across Rebecca's face as she returned to the stove. She served him a bowl of oatmeal that was perfectly cooked, creamy but not mushy, seasoned with cinnamon and a touch of honey she must have found in his nearly bare pantry. It was, he realized with surprise, delicious. "You're a good cook," he admitted, reluctantly. "I had to learn to make a lot from a little," Rebecca said, settling across from him with her own smaller portion. "When you're poor, you get creative with whatever you can find." They ate in companionable silence, the morning light growing stronger outside the windows. Ezra found himself stealing glances at his guest, trying to reconcile this composed, capable woman with the desperate creature he had found collapsed by his mailbox yesterday. There was more to Rebecca Nash than he had initially assumed. "I should check on the animals," he said when they finished eating. "Then I'll walk you to the main road. You can catch a ride to town from there." "Of course." Rebecca began clearing the dishes with practiced efficiency. "Would it be all right if I helped with the animals first? I grew up on a farm, before everything changed. I know my way around livestock." Ezra wanted to refuse. The sooner she left, the sooner he could return to his familiar isolation. But something in her voice, a wistful note that spoke of better times, made him nod instead. They walked together to the barn, Ezra's long strides shortened to accommodate Rebecca's slower pace. She was clearly still weak from her ordeal, but she moved with determination, her eyes taking in the details of his farm with the attention of someone who understood what they were seeing. "You have good land here," she observed. "Rich soil, good drainage. This must have been beautiful once." "It was," Ezra replied before he could stop himself. Then, more defensively, "It still could be." "I'm sure it could." Rebecca's tone held no judgment, only understanding. Inside the barn, the extent of Ezra's neglect was even more apparent. The stalls needed mucking, the animals looked thin, and everything had the air of minimal care rather than proper husbandry. Rebecca took it all in without comment, but Ezra saw her wince when she noticed the condition of his milk cow, Bessie. "When did you last milk her?" Rebecca asked gently. "Yesterday morning," Ezra lied. It had actually been 2 days, and the cow's obvious discomfort made his neglect apparent. Without waiting for permission, Rebecca found a clean bucket and settled on the milking stool beside Bessie. The cow, who had been skittish and difficult for Ezra in recent months, immediately calmed under Rebecca's gentle hand. Within minutes, she was producing a steady stream of rich, creamy milk. "You have a way with animals," Ezra observed. "Animals don't judge you by your appearance," Rebecca replied. "They only care if you're kind to them." The simple statement hit Ezra with unexpected force. How long had it been since he had shown kindness to anything, even his own animals? How long since he had cared about anything beyond his own pain? "I'll help you with the rest of the chores," Rebecca said, rising from the milking stool with a slight grunt of effort. "It's the least I can do." "You don't have to. I want to." She met his eyes directly. "Please, let me feel useful for a little while." Together they mucked out the stalls, fed the animals, and gathered the eggs from his small flock of chickens. Rebecca worked steadily despite her obvious physical limitations, never complaining, never asking for rest. She had a gentle competence that reminded Ezra painfully of Sarah, who had loved the farm work as much as he once had. They were finishing up when they heard the sound of multiple horse-drawn buggies coming up the lane. Ezra looked out to see Jacob Yoder leading a group of men from the district, all armed with tools and ready to help with the harvest he had been dreading. "Looks like you have company," Rebecca observed, following his gaze. "The community," Ezra explained, his jaw tightening. "They've decided to help whether I want it or not." "That sounds like a blessing, not a problem." "You don't understand. I'm not ready for this. I can't." "Ezra," Rebecca placed a gentle hand on his arm. When people offer help, sometimes the kindest thing you can do is accept it. Before he could respond, Jacob was calling out from the yard. "Morning, Ezra. We brought plenty of hands today. Should have your corn in by evening." Ezra walked slowly from the barn, Rebecca trailing a few steps behind. The sight that greeted him would have warmed his heart in better times. A dozen men from his community, ranging in age from teenagers to elders, all ready to pitch in with the work he had been unable to face alone. But their presence also meant exposure, questions, explanations he wasn't prepared to give. And now there was the added complication of Rebecca, whose presence would certainly raise eyebrows in their traditional community. "Jacob," Ezra nodded to his neighbor, then gestured awkwardly toward Rebecca. "This is Rebecca. She was caught in the storm last night." The men's eyes took in Rebecca's appearance, her obvious poverty, her weight, her non-Amish clothing, and Ezra could see the questions forming. In their close-knit community, strangers were rare and always noteworthy. "Miss," Jacob tipped his hat politely, but his eyes were curious and slightly wary. "I hope you found adequate shelter." "Mr. Miller was very kind," Rebecca replied with quiet dignity. "I'll be moving on this morning." "Heading to town, then?" asked Samuel Byler, one of the younger men. "It's a fair walk. We could give you a ride when we're finished here." "That's very generous, thank you." Ezra felt a strange twist in his stomach at how quickly the arrangements were being made for Rebecca's departure. It was what he wanted, what he had told her would happen. So why did he feel reluctant to see her go? "Well then," Jacob said, clapping his hands together, "let's get to work. Ezra, you know your fields better than anyone. Where should we start?" The next several hours passed in a blur of activity. The men worked with the efficient coordination that comes from years of community cooperation, their movements synchronized like a well-rehearsed dance. They cut corn, loaded wagons, and worked their way systematically across fields that had seemed overwhelming when Ezra contemplated them alone. Rebecca made herself useful by preparing food and drink for the workers, moving between the kitchen and the fields with surprising energy. She seemed to anticipate what was needed before anyone asked, appearing with cold water during the hottest part of the day, sandwiches when the men paused for lunch, and gentle encouragement for the younger workers who were struggling to keep up. Ezra found himself watching her more than he should have. Despite her physical limitations and obvious exhaustion, she threw herself into helping with a dedication that impressed even the most traditional members of the community. She didn't try to insert herself into conversations or draw attention to her contributions. She simply worked, quietly and efficiently, making everyone's day a little easier. "She's a hard worker," Jacob commented during one of their brief breaks, nodding toward where Rebecca was helping his teenage son load corn into a wagon. "She's leaving today," Ezra replied quickly. "Shame. Good help is hard to find." Jacob's tone was casual, but his eyes were shrewd. "Seems like she could be useful around here." "I don't need help." Jacob looked pointedly around the farm, at the sagging fences, the weedy garden, the general air of neglect that even a day of community effort couldn't entirely disguise. "None of us needs help, Ezra, but sometimes accepting it is the path back to grace." Before Ezra could respond, a commotion arose from the far field. One of the younger men, Samuel's 16-year-old son David, had caught his foot in a groundhog hole and fallen hard. From the way he was holding his leg and the pallor of his face, it was clear the injury was serious. The men gathered around the boy, offering conflicting advice and growing increasingly worried as David's condition seemed to worsen. His leg was bent at an unnatural angle, and he was beginning to show signs of shock. "We need to get him to the hospital," Samuel said, his voice tight with parental fear. "But the nearest one is 40 minutes away, and I don't know if we should move him." "Let me look at him." Rebecca's voice cut through the concerned murmur of the men. She was already moving toward the injured boy, her demeanor transformed from helpful guest to competent professional. "Are you a doctor?" Samuel asked, hope and desperation warring in his voice. "A nurse. Or I was." Rebecca knelt beside David, her hands moving with practiced skill as she assessed his condition. "David, Can you hear me? I'm going to check your leg, okay? The boy nodded weakly, his face pale with pain and fear. Rebecca's examination was thorough, but gentle, her voice calm and reassuring as she explained what she was doing. The good news is it's not a compound fracture, she announced after several tense minutes. But his leg is definitely broken, and we need to immobilize it before we move him. Do you have any straight boards we could use for splints? The men scattered to find materials while Rebecca continued to monitor David's condition, checking his pulse, watching for signs of internal bleeding, keeping him conscious and talking. Her transformation was remarkable. Gone was the hesitant, grateful guest, replaced by a confident medical professional who clearly knew exactly what she was doing. Working with supplies the men provided, Rebecca fashioned a makeshift but effective splint, stabilizing David's leg with a competence that impressed everyone present. She then coordinated his careful transfer to a wagon that would take him to the hospital, giving detailed instructions to Samuel about what to watch for during the journey. "You probably saved that boy's life," Jacob said quietly as they watched the wagon disappear down the lane. "Certainly saved him from permanent damage." Rebecca shook her head. "Any nurse would have done the same. I just happened to be here." But Ezra could see that her actions had earned her something more valuable than gratitude from the assembled men. These were people who valued practical skills and quiet competence above all else, and Rebecca had demonstrated both in abundance. As the day wore on and the harvest work continued, Ezra noticed a change in how the community men interacted with Rebecca. Where there had been polite wariness before, now there was genuine appreciation. They sought her opinion on small matters, included her in their conversations, and treated her less like a stranger and more like a neighbor. And Rebecca, for her part, seemed to bloom under their acceptance. The defensive posture she had maintained since arriving began to relax, and glimpses of her true personality began to show through. A quick wit, a gentle sense of humor, and an obvious intelligence that had been hidden beneath her circumstances. When evening finally came and the last wagon of corn had been loaded, the men gathered in Ezra's yard for the traditional end-of-harvest meal. Rebecca, despite having worked as hard as anyone all day, insisted on preparing food for the group, somehow managing to create a feast from Ezra's sparse pantry and contributions from the other wives who had sent supplies. "This is delicious," proclaimed the Stoltzfus, the eldest of the group, as he helped himself to seconds of Rebecca's cornbread. "Haven't tasted cooking this good since my Martha passed." Rebecca blushed at the compliment but accepted it graciously. Around the table, a conversation flowed easily, touching on community news, weather prospects, and plans for the coming winter. For the first time since Sarah's death, Ezra found himself part of a social gathering that felt natural rather than forced. But as the meal wound down and the men began preparing to leave, the reality of Rebecca's situation reasserted itself. She would be leaving with one of them, riding to town to continue her uncertain journey. The thought filled Ezra with an unexpected sense of loss. "Ready, Miss?" Samuel asked, rising from the table. He had returned from the hospital with good news about his son. The leg would heal completely with proper care. "My wagon's got room, and I pass right through town." "Of course." Rebecca began clearing the table with automatic efficiency. "Just let me clean up these dishes. Leave them," Ezra heard himself say. The words surprised him as much as they did everyone else. "They can wait." Rebecca looked at him with questioning eyes. Around the table, conversation had stopped, and all eyes were focused on Ezra. He felt heat rise in his cheeks, but pressed on. "I mean, there's no rush. If you want to finish what you started." It wasn't much of an offer, and certainly not what anyone would call a proper invitation. But Rebecca seemed to understand what he was trying to say, even if he wasn't entirely sure himself. "I could stay a little longer," she said carefully, "if you think that would be helpful." Samuel looked from Ezra to Rebecca and back again, clearly sensing undercurrents he didn't fully understand. "Well, if you change your mind, miss, you know where to find us." The offer stabbed. After the men had gone, Ezra and Rebecca found themselves alone in the kitchen, surrounded by the detritus of the day's activities. The silence felt different now than it had the night before. Less awkward, but somehow more loaded with possibility. "You didn't have to defend me to them," Rebecca said finally, beginning to clear the dishes, despite his earlier words. "I wasn't defending you, I was just being practical. You're a good worker, and there's still plenty to do around here. Is that all?" The question hung in the air between them. Ezra could have given her the easy answer, could have confirmed that it was purely practical, nothing more. But something about the day, watching her with the animals, seeing her take charge during David's crisis, witnessing her easy integration into his community, had shaken something loose inside him. "I don't know," he admitted. I haven't wanted company in a long time. But today was good," Rebecca finished for him. Yes, today was good. They worked together to clean up from the day, moving around each other with surprising ease for two people who had been strangers less than 24 hours earlier. When everything was clean and put away, they found themselves standing in the middle of the kitchen, uncertain what came next. "I should probably sleep in the barn tonight," Rebecca said. "It wouldn't be proper for me to stay in the house again, with you being unmarried and all. The barn's not heated, and there's a storm coming." Even as he said it, Ezra wasn't sure it was true, but he found himself reluctant to send her out into the cold darkness. "I've slept in worse places. The couch is fine. Like last night." Rebecca nodded, but something in her expression suggested she understood that this arrangement couldn't continue indefinitely. They were walking a line between propriety and necessity, between kindness and impropriety, that would eventually have to be resolved one way or another. "Ezra," she said, as he turned to go upstairs, "thank you for letting me stay, for letting me help today. It's been a long time since I felt like I belonged somewhere, even temporarily." "Thank you," he replied, "for helping with David, for working so hard, he struggled for words, for making the day better." As he climbed the stairs to his bedroom, Ezra found his mind racing with thoughts and questions he hadn't entertained in years. What was he doing? What did he want from this situation? What did Rebecca want? He lay in bed listening to her move about downstairs, just as he had the night before. But tonight, the sound didn't fill him with anxiety. Instead, it filled him with something he had almost forgotten how to feel. But hope, he knew, was a dangerous thing for someone who had learned to expect only loss and disappointment. Tomorrow would bring new decisions, new complications, new opportunities for everything to fall apart. For tonight, though, he allowed himself to imagine what it might be like to have someone to share the burden of keeping his life together. Someone who understood hard work and harder times. Someone who didn't expect him to be anything other than what he was. As sleep finally claimed him, Ezra Miller dared to wonder if maybe, just maybe, he was ready to start living again. 3 weeks had passed since Rebecca's arrival, and an unspoken routine had settled over the Miller farm. Each morning Ezra would wake to the sound of Rebecca moving quietly in the kitchen, preparing breakfast and tending to tasks that had been neglected for months. Each evening they would work together in companionable silence, sharing simple meals and the satisfaction of a day's honest work. The farm was transforming under their combined efforts. Fields that had been choked with weeds now showed neat rows where winter wheat was beginning to sprout. The barn had been thoroughly cleaned and organized. The animals were healthier and more content, and even the farmhouse itself was beginning to look like a home again, rather than a monument to grief. But it was the subtle changes in Ezra himself that would have surprised anyone who had known him during his years of isolation. His shoulders no longer carried the perpetual slump of defeat. His eyes, while still shadowed with loss, had regained some of their former alertness. Most remarkably, he had begun to fill out again, gaining back some of the weight he had lost during his darkest period. Rebecca, too, was changing. The desperate edge that had marked her arrival was softening into something approaching contentment. She moved with more confidence around the farm, her natural competence expressing itself in 100 small improvements. Though she remained heavy, Her face had lost its hollow look of malnutrition, and there were moments when her laughter would ring out across the yard, surprising them both with its genuine joy. On this particular November morning, Ezra was in the barn repairing a stall door when he heard the familiar sound of Jacob Yoder's buggy coming up the lane. But this time, Jacob wasn't alone. Through the barn door, Ezra could see that Martha Yoder, Jacob's wife, was with him, along with two other women from the community, Sarah Byler and Ruth Stoltzfus. Ezra's stomach tightened with apprehension. Individual visits from his male neighbors were one thing, but when the community's women came calling together, it usually meant serious business. He watched through the window as Rebecca emerged from the chicken coop with a basket of eggs, greeting the visitors with her usual courtesy, but obvious nervousness. "Ezra," Jacob's voice carried clearly across the yard. "Come join us. The women would like a word." There was no avoiding it. Ezra set down his tools and arced slowly toward the group, gathered near the house. Rebecca stood slightly apart, her hands clasped in front of her, clearly understanding that she was likely the subject of this impromptu community meeting. "Ladies," Ezra nodded politely to the three women, all of whom he had known for years. They had been Sarah's friends, had attended her funeral, had brought him countless meals during the early days of his grief. Ezra, Martha Yoder, stepped forward, her weathered face kind but serious. "We need to talk about your situation here." "What situation would that be? Don't be obtuse." Sarah Byler's voice carried a sharper edge than Martha's. She was a woman who believed in direct speaking and didn't have patience for dancing around difficult topics. "You've had an unmarried English woman living in your house for 3 weeks. People are talking." Ezra felt his jaw tighten. "People always talk." "Yes, but this time they have reason." Ruth Stoltzfus, the gentlest of the three, looked genuinely concerned. "Ezra, we know you've been grieving. We know how hard these past years have been. But this arrangement, it's not proper." "Rebecca has been nothing but helpful and respectful," Ezra said, his voice carefully controlled. "She's worked harder than anyone could expect, and she's asked for nothing in return." "That's not the point," Sarah replied. "The point is that you're a single man and she's a single woman, and you're living under the same roof without benefit of marriage. It's causing scandal." "Scandal?" Ezra's voice rose despite his efforts to stay calm. "She was starving in a ditch when I found her. Was I supposed to let her die to avoid gossip?" "Of course not," Martha said quickly. "What you did initially was right and Christian. But Ezra, that was 3 weeks ago. If she needed temporary shelter, that's one thing. But this has gone beyond temporary." Rebecca, who had been silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke. "They're right, Ezra. I've stayed too long. I'll pack my things and be gone by evening." "Where will you go?" The question came out more harshly than Ezra intended. "Back to the streets? Back to sleeping under bridges?" "That's not your concern," Rebecca replied, but her voice lacked conviction. "I survived before. I'll survive again." "Will you?" Jacob asked quietly. "Winter's coming, Rebecca. You won't last a month out there, not in your condition." The brutal honesty of his words hung in the air. Everyone present knew he was right. Rebecca's health, while improved from her arrival, was still fragile. The weight she carried, the years of poor living, the approaching Pennsylvania winter, it would be a death sentence. "Then what do you suggest?" Ezra asked, his voice tight with frustration. "What would satisfy the gossips and still keep her alive?" The three women exchanged meaningful glances. It was Martha who finally spoke. "There is a solution, Ezra. It's not ideal, perhaps, but it would address both problems. Which is marriage." The word fell into the conversation like a stone into still water, creating ripples of shock and discomfort. Ezra stared at Martha, as if she had suggested he sprout wings and fly. "Marriage," he repeated flatly. "It would solve everything," Sarah said, warming to the idea. "Rebecca would have a home and security. You would have a wife to help with the farm and household. and the community would have no reason for complaint. I barely know her, Ezra protested. She's not even Amish. The bishop would never. Bishop Haustitler has already indicated he would be willing to consider it, Ruth said quietly. If Rebecca were willing to convert, to learn our ways and embrace our faith, he would perform the ceremony. Ezra turned to stare at Rebecca, who had gone very pale during this exchange. Did you know about this? Did you put them up to this? No. Rebecca's denial was immediate and fierce. I had no idea. I would never. I'm not looking for charity marriage, Ezra. I'm not that desperate. But even as she spoke, they all knew it wasn't entirely true. She was that desperate or close to it. The alternative being offered was continued homelessness and almost certain death. Think about it practically, Jacob said in his calm, reasonable voice. You need help with the farm. She needs security and a home. You work well together. We've all seen it. And Ezra, Sarah's been gone 5 years. You can't mourn forever. Don't. Ezra's voice was dangerously quiet. Don't bring Sarah into this. Sarah would want you to live, Martha said gently. She would want you to be happy, and she would want you to help someone in need. By marrying them, Ezra's laugh was bitter. That's not help. That's using someone's desperation to solve a practical problem. Is it? Ruth asked. Or is it two people helping each other find their way back to life? The question struck closer to home than Ezra wanted to admit. Over the past 3 weeks, he had felt more alive than he had in years. Rebecca's presence had brought purpose back to his days, companionship to his evenings, hope to his future. But marriage? That was something else entirely. I need time to think, he said finally. Of course, Martha agreed. But Ezra, you can't think too long. If Rebecca is going to stay, this needs to be resolved soon. People are already asking Bishop Haustitler to intervene. The women began gathering themselves to leave, their mission accomplished. They had planted the seed, now they would let it grow or wither as it would. Rebecca, Sarah Byler paused at her buggy. If you decide to stay, you'll need instruction in our faith and our ways. I would be willing to teach you. Thank you, Rebecca replied quietly. That's very kind. After the buggies had disappeared down the lane, Ezra and Rebecca stood in the yard, both struggling with the weight of what had just occurred. The easy companionship they had developed over the past weeks felt suddenly strained, complicated by expectations and possibilities that neither had anticipated. I should start packing, Rebecca said finally, breaking the uncomfortable silence. Should you? She looked at him with surprise. You can't seriously be considering their suggestion. I don't know what I'm considering. Ezra ran a hand through his hair, feeling overwhelmed by the sudden pressure to make a decision that would affect the rest of his life. 3 weeks ago, I was planning to let the farm fail and waste away to nothing. Now you feel obligated to marry a stranger because she helped you clean your barn. Is that what you are, a stranger? The question caught Rebecca off guard. She studied his face, searching for something she couldn't quite name. What else would I be? I don't know, but these past weeks, they've been the first good weeks I've had in 5 years. The farm is starting to feel like home again instead of a tomb. I look forward to getting up in the morning instead of dreading another empty day. Ezra, I'm not talking about love, he said quickly. I know that's not what this would be. I loved Sarah, and she's gone. I'm not looking to replace her. But maybe there are different kinds of partnerships. Practical ones. Ones based on mutual need and respect instead of romance. Rebecca was quiet for a long moment, considering his words. When she spoke, her voice was carefully controlled. And what would I bring to such a partnership, besides my obvious needs and problems? You're asking what you're worth? Yes. Ezra looked at her standing there in the afternoon sunlight, her face still bearing traces of uncertainty despite her growing confidence. How could he explain what she had brought to his life? How could he quantify the value of shared meals and comfortable silences, of competent hands and gentle humor, of simply having someone who understood the rhythm of farm life? "You brought me back to life," he said simply. "Maybe that's enough. And what would you expect from a wife? In a practical marriage, I mean." The question was fair, but difficult to answer. Ezra had never considered marriage as anything other than a union of love and faith. The idea of negotiating terms felt strange and somehow diminished. But if they were going to do this, honesty was essential. "Help with the farm and household," he said slowly, thinking it through as he spoke. "Company, someone to share the work and the responsibility. As for other things," he felt heat rise in his cheeks. "I wouldn't expect or demand anything you weren't willing to give." Rebecca nodded, her expression thoughtful. "And children? Would you want children?" The question hit Ezra like a physical blow. He and Sarah had wanted children desperately, had lost their only child along with her. The thought of trying again, of risking that kind of loss. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe someday, if it happened naturally, but it wouldn't be a requirement, because you're afraid to hope for that again." Her insight was uncomfortably accurate. Yes, they stood in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Around them the farm continued its daily rhythm, chickens scratching in the dirt, cows lowing in the pasture, the wind rustling through the bare branches of the oak tree that shaded the house. "If I stayed," Rebecca said finally, "if we did this thing, I would want to be a real wife, not just a hired hand who happens to live in the house." "What do you mean?" "I mean I would want to build something together, a real partnership, a real marriage, even if it didn't start with love. I've seen too much loneliness to settle for a business arrangement disguised as matrimony." Ezra studied her face, seeing determination there, along with vulnerability. "You think love could grow between us? I think respect and affection and shared purpose can be the foundation for something deeper. Yes, but it would have to be a choice we both made every day. To try to be open to the possibility, to not hold back parts of ourselves out of fear. And if it doesn't work, if we find we're too different, or if the community never accepts you, or if, then we'll face those problems when they come. But Ezra, the alternative is that you go back to dying slowly by yourself, and I go back to dying quickly in the streets. At least this way we're choosing to try to live." Her words carried a weight of truth that settled into Ezra's chest. He thought of the past weeks, of the gradual awakening of hope and purpose he had felt. He thought of his empty house, his neglected farm, his isolated existence. Then he thought of warm meals shared and comfortable conversations, of competent hands helping with difficult tasks, of laughter that had begun to chase away the shadows. "The community will expect a lot from you," he warned. "Learning our language, our customs, our faith. It won't be easy. And I'm not afraid of hard work. And I'm not afraid of change, if it's change for the better. Some people will never fully accept you. There will always be whispers, always be those who remember that you were an outsider. I've lived with worse than whispers." Ezra nodded, recognizing the truth in her statement. "And you would really be willing to convert, to give up your old life entirely?" Rebecca was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice was sad but resolute. "What old life, Ezra? I lost everything that mattered to me years ago. I've been existing, not living. If your community, your faith can offer me a chance to build something new," she shrugged. "It seems like a gift, not a sacrifice." As the sun began to set behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Ezra made a decision that would change both their lives forever. "All right," he said quietly. "If you're willing, if you're sure, we'll try." Rebecca's smile was radiant with relief and gratitude. "Are you sure?" "No," Ezra admitted, "but I'm willing to find out." That evening, They sat at the kitchen table and began to plan their future with the same practical approach they had brought to repairing fences and harvesting crops. They discussed the conversion process, the marriage ceremony, the adjustments that would need to be made. But beneath the practical considerations lay a deeper current of hope and possibility that neither quite dared to acknowledge. As Rebecca prepared for bed that night, she paused in the kitchen doorway. "Ezra? Yes, thank you for taking a chance on me, for giving me a chance to be more than just a burden or a charity case. Thank you," he replied, "for giving me a reason to start living again." After she had gone upstairs to the small bedroom he had prepared for her, a concession to propriety during their engagement period, Ezra sat alone in the quiet kitchen. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new complications, new opportunities for everything to go wrong. But for the first time in 5 years, he found himself looking forward to tomorrow instead of simply enduring it. Outside, the first snow of winter had begun to fall, covering the farm in a blanket of pristine white. It was, Ezra thought, like the world was offering them a fresh start, a clean slate upon which to write a new story. He only hoped they would prove worthy of the gift. Winter had settled over Lancaster County with unusual severity, blanketing the Miller farm in snow that seemed to deepen with each passing day. Inside the warm kitchen, Rebecca sat hunched over a worn copy of the German Bible, her brow furrowed in concentration as she struggled with the unfamiliar words. Across from her, Sarah Byler watched with the patience of a woman who had taught Sunday school for 30 years. "Gott ist die Liebe," Sarah pronounced slowly. "God is love. Try again. Gott ist die Liebe." Rebecca repeated, her pronunciation careful but uncertain. "Better. The vowels need work, but you're improving." Sarah closed the book and leaned back in her chair. 3 months of lessons, and you're already reading simple passages. That's remarkable progress. Rebecca rubbed her temples, feeling the familiar ache that came from hours of intensive study. Learning Pennsylvania Dutch was proving even more challenging than she had anticipated. Complicated by the fact that she was simultaneously trying to master the theological concepts of Amish faith and the practical skills expected of an Amish wife. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm fooling myself," Rebecca admitted. "Maybe I'm too old, too set in my ways to really become one of you." "Becoming Amish isn't about perfection," Sarah replied gently. "It's about commitment to the community, to the faith, to the simple life. You've shown that commitment every day since you've been here." Through the window, Rebecca could see Ezra working in the barn, his breath visible in the cold air as he tended to the animals. Over the past 3 months, their relationship had settled into something comfortable but complex. They worked together seamlessly, shared meals and conversations, and had developed a deep respect for each other. But there was still a careful distance between them, an unspoken agreement not to push too hard or expect too much too soon. "How long were you married before you felt truly settled with Jacob?" Rebecca asked, surprising herself with the personal question. Sarah's weathered face softened with memory. "Oh, child, it took years. We married young, barely knew each other beyond Sunday singings, but love, real love, that grows slowly, like a good crop. You plant it, tend it, give it time to root properly, and if the soil isn't right, if the conditions aren't favorable, then you work harder to improve them. You don't give up on the crop just because the first season is difficult." Sarah reached across the table and patted Rebecca's hand. "Ezra is a good man, Rebecca. Wounded, but good. And you have a strength that I think even you don't fully recognize." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of a buggy coming up the lane. Through the snow, Rebecca could see Bishop Hostetler's distinctive black gelding pulling the familiar enclosed buggy. Her stomach tightened with nervous anticipation. "That will be the bishop," Sarah said, rising from the table. "Are you ready for this?" Rebecca nodded, though she felt anything but ready. Today was the day of her final examination before being accepted into the church community. If she passed, she and Ezra could be married in the spring. If she failed, she tried not to think about the alternative. Ezra appeared in the kitchen just as Bishop Hostetler knocked on the door, snow dusting his black coat and broad-brimmed hat. The bishop was a man in his 60s, with the kind of presence that commanded respect without demanding it. His eyes were shrewd but kind, and he had the measured way of speaking that came from years of settling disputes and guiding his flock through difficult decisions. "Ezra, Rebecca," he nodded to each in turn. "I trust you're both well this winter." "Very well, Bishop," Ezra replied. "Thank you for coming out in this weather. The Lord's work doesn't wait for fair skies." Bishop Hostetler removed his coat and hat, accepting the chair that Rebecca offered him at the kitchen table. "Now then, Rebecca, Sarah tells me you've been working very hard with your studies." "I've tried my best, Bishop." "Good. Let's begin with some basic questions about our faith. Can you recite the Lord's Prayer in German?" Rebecca had been preparing for this moment for weeks, but suddenly her mind felt blank. She took a deep breath and began, "Unser Vater im Himmel, geheiligt werde dein Name." The words came slowly but correctly, each phrase carefully pronounced. When she finished, Bishop Hostetler nodded approvingly. "Very good. Now, can you explain to me the principle of Gelassenheit?" This was more complex territory. Rebecca had struggled with many of the Amish concepts, but this one, the idea of yielding oneself to God's will and the community's wisdom, had resonated deeply with her own experiences. "Gelassenheit means surrendering yourself," she began carefully, "not just to God, but to the community, to humility, to putting others before yourself. It means accepting that your individual desires aren't as important as what's best for everyone." "And how does this apply to marriage?" Rebecca glanced at Ezra, who was listening intently but staying silent, as was appropriate during her examination. "In marriage, it means both partners must be willing to yield to each other, to work for the good of the family, rather than just personal happiness. It means being willing to compromise, to sacrifice, to put the marriage before individual wants. And you believe you can do this. Coming from the English world, where individual desire is often placed above community need." The question struck at the heart of Rebecca's deepest fears about her ability to truly belong in this community. She was quiet for a moment, thinking about her answer. "Bishop, I've learned that individual desire without community, without purpose, without something greater than yourself, it's empty. I spent 3 years living only for myself, trying only to survive, and it nearly killed me, not just physically, but spiritually. I found more meaning in 3 months of working towards something bigger than myself than I found in years of pursuing only my own needs." Bishop Hostetler studied her face carefully. "That's a mature understanding. But understanding and living are different things. Marriage will test your commitment to these principles in ways you can't imagine. I know that, Bishop, and I know I'll make mistakes, but I also know that I want to try, not just because I need security, but because I believe this way of life, this community, this faith. It's shown me who I could be at my best." The examination continued for another hour, covering everything from practical household management to complex theological questions. Through it all, Rebecca felt a growing confidence, not because the answers came easily, but because she realized how much she had truly absorbed and internalized over the past month. Finally, Bishop Hostetler sat back in his chair and looked at both Rebecca and Ezra. "Rebecca, you've shown remarkable progress in a short time. Your German needs work, and you'll continue learning our ways for years to come. But I believe your heart is in the right place." Rebecca held her breath, waiting for the decision that would determine her future. "I'm prepared to accept you into our church community. The baptism can take place next month, and if you and Ezra are still of the same mind, marriage can follow in the spring." Relief flooded through Rebecca so powerfully that she felt lightheaded. "Thank you, Bishop. I won't disappoint you." "You'll disappoint me many times, Bishop," Hostetler said with a slight smile. "We all disappoint each other. The question is whether you'll keep trying to do better." After the bishop and Sarah had left, Rebecca and Ezra found themselves alone in the kitchen, the weight of what had just occurred settling between them. In 4 months, they would be married. What had begun as a desperate solution to an impossible situation was becoming increasingly real. "How do you feel?" Ezra asked quietly. "Terrified," Rebecca admitted. "Relieved, hopeful, all at the same time. That seems appropriate." They worked together to prepare dinner, moving around each other with the easy coordination they had developed over the months. But there was a new awareness between them now, a recognition that they were no longer just 2 people helping each other survive, but 2 people committed to building a life together. "Ezra," Rebecca said as they sat down to eat, "I want you to know what I said to the bishop about marriage, about yielding to each other. I meant it. But I also want you to know that I don't expect you to love me the way you loved Sarah." Ezra looked up from his plate, surprised by her directness. "Rebecca, let me finish. I know this isn't a love match. I know you're doing this partly out of kindness and partly out of practicality. But I want you to know that I'm grateful for that. I'm not looking for passion or romance. I'm looking for partnership, for respect, for the chance to build something meaningful together. And if more than that develops over time, then we'll deal with that when it happens. But I don't want either of us to feel pressured to feel something we don't feel, or to pretend to emotions that aren't real." Ezra was quiet for a long moment, considering her word. "You know, when Sarah and I married, everyone expected us to be madly in love. And we were, in our way. But even that kind of love, it changes over time. It deepens in some ways, becomes more practical in others. Maybe what we're building isn't so different, maybe not. I want you to know something too," Ezra continued. "What I feel for you, it may not be the same as what I felt for Sarah, but it's not nothing. You've become important to me, Rebecca, more important than I expected." The admission hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable. Rebecca felt her heart skip in a way that surprised her with its intensity. "You've become important to me too," she said softly. That night, Rebecca lay in her small bedroom, listening to the wind howl around the house and thinking about the future that was rapidly approaching. In 4 months, she would become Mrs. Ezra Miller, a member of the Amish community, a wife and hopefully someday a mother. The girl who had once dreamed of traveling the world and living independently in the city would disappear forever, replaced by someone she was still learning to become. The thought should have frightened her. Instead, she found herself filled with anticipation. Downstairs, Ezra sat in his chair by the fireplace, staring into the flames and thinking similar thoughts. He had loved Sarah with the passion of youth, had mourned her with the desperation of a man who couldn't imagine life without her. What he felt for Rebecca was quieter, steadier, built on shared work and mutual respect rather than romantic idealization. But as he sat there in the warm circle of firelight, listening to the subtle sounds of another person sharing his home, he realized that this quieter feeling might be exactly what he needed. Not a replacement for what he had lost, but something entirely new, something that honored his past while building toward a different kind of future. 3 days later, the community gathered at the Yuda farm for Rebecca's baptism. The ceremony was simple but profound, conducted in the same barn where generations of Amish had celebrated the milestones of faith and life. Rebecca knelt before Bishop Hustetler, water poured over her head as she formally renounced her old life and committed herself to her new faith. As she rose, dripping and transformed, the congregation began to sing an ancient hymn in German. Rebecca didn't understand all the words, but she understood the meaning: welcome, acceptance, the embrace of a community that had decided to claim her as one of their own. Ezra watched from the men's section, feeling a surprising rush of pride and protectiveness. This woman who had arrived at his farm as a desperate stranger had shown remarkable courage in embracing a completely foreign way of life. Whatever their marriage would become, he knew she would be a partner worthy of respect. After the service, the community gathered for the traditional meal and celebration. Rebecca found herself surrounded by women, offering advice, recipes, and friendship. For the first time since her mother's death, she felt like she belonged somewhere, like she was part of something larger than herself. "You did well," Martha Yoder told her as they served food to the gathered families. "I've seen many conversions over the years, and yours feels genuine." "It is genuine," Rebecca replied. "This community, this way of life, it's given me back my sense of purpose." "And Ezra, how are things progressing there?" Rebecca glanced across the room to where Ezra was talking with Jacob and several other men. "We're learning each other, building something together. I think we'll be happy, in our own way." "That's more than many marriages start with," Martha observed. "Love is a fine thing, but respect and partnership, those last longer." As the celebration continued around them, Rebecca felt a deep sense of contentment settle over her. She was no longer the desperate woman who had collapsed by Ezra's mailbox 6 months ago. She was Rebecca Miller to be, a member of this community, a woman with a future and a purpose. The transformation wasn't complete. It might never be complete. There would always be moments when she felt like an outsider, always be aspects of Amish life that challenged her. But she had found something she had thought lost forever: hope for a meaningful life. When the time came to leave, Ezra helped her into the buggy with a gentleness that was becoming familiar. As they drove home through the snowy landscape, both were quiet, lost in their own thoughts about the significance of the day. "Any regrets?" Ezra asked as they turned into their lane. Rebecca considered the question seriously before answering. "No, no regrets, only anticipation." "For what?" "For seeing what we can build together. For becoming the person I'm meant to be in this new life." She hesitated, then continued with quiet honesty. "For learning what it means to be your wife." Ezra felt his heart skip at her words. "I'm looking forward to that too." As they settled the horse and headed into the warm house, both felt the weight and promise of the commitment they had made. In 3 months, they would stand before this same community and pledge themselves to each other for life. It was a daunting prospect, but no longer a frightening one. They were no longer two broken people desperately trying to survive. They were two people who had chosen to heal together, to build something new from the ashes of their separate losses. It might not be the love story either had imagined in their youth, but it was their story, and it was worth writing. The morning of Rebecca's wedding dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of brilliant April sunshine that made the Pennsylvania countryside look like something from a painting. The Miller farm had been transformed for the occasion. The house spotless, the yard meticulously groomed, tables and benches arranged in neat rows to accommodate the nearly 200 community members who would witness the ceremony. Rebecca stood before the small mirror in her bedroom, adjusting the dark blue dress that Martha Yoder and several other women had helped her sew. It was simple by English standards, but beautiful in its plainness, well-fitted, modest, made from good fabric that would serve her for years to come. Her hair was pulled back in the traditional style, covered by a white prayer cap that marked her as a married woman. At 26, she looked healthier than she had in years. The months of regular meals and purposeful work had given her color and energy, though she remained heavy. More importantly, there was a peace in her face that hadn't been there when she first arrived, a sense of belonging that transformed her entire bearing. "You look beautiful," Sarah Byler said, entering the room with a small bouquet of spring flowers. "These are from my garden, something for you to carry." "Thank you." Rebecca's voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly as she accepted the flowers. "Sarah, what if I'm making a mistake? What if I can't be the wife Ezra needs?" "Child, every bride has those fears, even those who marry for love." Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, her weathered hands folding in her lap. "But I've watched you and Ezra these past months. I've seen how you work together, how you care for each other. That's a stronger foundation than many marriages have. But what if love never comes? What if we're always just partners in survival?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering her words carefully. "Rebecca, I've been married 43 years. There have been seasons of passion, seasons of companionship, seasons when we barely liked each other. and seasons when love felt like the most natural thing in the world. Marriage isn't one feeling, it's a choice you make every day to build a life with someone. And you think we can do that? Build a real life together? I think you already have. Downstairs, Ezra was struggling with his own pre-ceremony nerves. He stood in the kitchen that had become so familiar over the past months, adjusting his black vest and trying to calm the rapid beating of his heart. Jacob Yoder and Bishop Hostetler sat at the table, offering the kind of steady masculine support that Amish communities provided for grooms. Having second thoughts, Jacob asked with gentle humor. Third and fourth thoughts, Ezra admitted. This feels different from when I married Sarah. More complicated. Different circumstances call for different approaches. Bishop Hostetler observed. You and Sarah were young, full of romantic dreams. You and Rebecca are older, more experienced in life's hardships. That doesn't make your union less valid. What if I can't love her the way she deserves? What if I'm still too broken from losing Sarah? Bishop Hostetler leaned forward, his expression serious. Ezra, the heart has infinite capacity for love, but not always the same kind of love. What you felt for Sarah was the love of youth and innocence. What you might feel for Rebecca could be the love of maturity and understanding. Don't judge one by the standards of the other, and if love doesn't come at all, then you'll have respect, partnership, and shared purpose. That's kept many couples together through long, productive lives. But Ezra, the bishop's voice softened. I've watched you both these past months. The way you look at her when you think no one is watching, the way she lights up when you come in from the fields. Love might already be there, you just might not recognize it yet. By mid-morning, buggies had begun arriving from all corners of the district. The entire Amish community seemed to be in attendance, along with several English neighbors who had come to know and respect Rebecca during her time at the farm. The house buzzed with activity as women arranged food and men set up seating areas. Rebecca watched from her bedroom window as more and more people arrived. In her old life, the thought of being the center of attention for so many people would have terrified her. But these weren't strangers anymore. They were her community, her new family, people who had watched her transformation and chosen to accept her as one of their own. It's time, Martha announced from the doorway. Are you ready? Rebecca took one last look in the mirror, smoothing her dress and touching the prayer cap that would mark her new status. I'm ready. The ceremony was held in the main room of the house, with the congregation seated on backless benches arranged in careful order. Rebecca and Ezra sat facing each other in plain wooden chairs, Bishop Hostetler standing between them with his worn Bible. If you want to, we will, but Rebecca, promise me you won't let this consume you. Promise me you won't let the fear of what might not be destroy the happiness of what is. I promise to try. Later that afternoon, Rebecca found herself in Martha Yoder's kitchen, helping to prepare food for the upcoming church service, while wrestling with the decision to confide her fears to the older woman. Martha had become not just a neighbor, but a true friend and mentor, someone whose wisdom Rebecca had come to value deeply. You're quiet today, Martha observed as they worked together to knead bread dough. Something troubling you? Rebecca hesitated, then decided that keeping her worries to herself was doing more harm than good. Martha, can I ask you something personal? Of course, child. How long were you and Jacob married before your first child was born? Martha's hands stilled on the dough, and she looked up with understanding in her eyes. So that's what's weighing on your heart. We've been married 2 years, and nothing. I'm beginning to wonder if there's something wrong with me. 2 years feels like forever when you're waiting, but in God's timing, it's not so long. Martha resumed her kneading, her movements rhythmic and soothing. Jacob and I were married 4 years before our Sarah was born. 4 years of hoping and praying and wondering what we were doing wrong. 4 years? But you have so many children. 7 living children. But it took time for the first. And between the second and third, there was a gap of 5 years. Between the fourth and fifth, 3 years. Children come in their own time, Rebecca, not ours. The knowledge that even fertile, healthy couples could struggle with timing was both comforting and frustrating. But what if they don't come at all? What if God has other plans for us? Martha set down her dough and turned to face Rebecca direct. Then you'll be the aunt who spoils everyone else's children, the woman who has time and energy to help neighbors in crisis, the couple who can take in foster children who need temporary homes. God uses all kinds of people to build his kingdom. Rebecca, not all of them are parents, but Ezra would be such a good father, and he's a good husband. That's no small thing. Some women have many children with men who are poor fathers and poor husbands. You have a man who loves you deeply and works beside you every day to build something meaningful. That's a gift not to be taken lightly. As Rebecca walked home in the fading light of evening, Martha's words echoed in her mind. It was true that she and Ezra had built something special together, something that went far beyond the practical arrangement they had originally envisioned. Their marriage had become a source of strength and joy not just for them, but for their entire community. She found Ezra in the kitchen preparing a simple supper and humming softly to himself. The sight of him moving comfortably around the space they had made their own filled her with the kind of contentment she had never expected to find in life. "How was your visit with Martha?" he asked, looking up from the stove with the smile that still had the power to make her heart skip. "Enlightening. She reminded me of some things I needed to remember, such as how blessed we already are, such as how much happiness we found in just being together." Ezra set down his spoon and crossed to where she stood, pulling her into his arms with the easy affection that characterized their relationship. "And are you happy, Mrs. Miller? Really happy?" Rebecca looked up into his face, seeing the love and concern there, feeling the strength of his arms around her and the solid warmth of his body against hers. "Happier than I ever dreamed possible. Children or no children, I have more than I ever dared hope for." "Good, because I feel the same way." That night, as they lay together in their bed, Rebecca allowed herself to truly appreciate what they had built together. Their physical relationship had developed slowly, naturally, growing from tentative affection into something that surprised them both with its depth and satisfaction. Ezra was a gentle, considerate lover who treated her body with reverence and care, and their intimacy had become one of the strongest bonds in their marriage. "Ezra," she said softly in the darkness, "whatever happens with children, I want you to know that these 2 years with you have been the best of my life." "Mine too," he replied, pulling her closer. "Every day with you feels like a gift I didn't earn, but somehow received anyway." "Maybe that's what love is," Rebecca mused, "a gift we don't earn but receive anyway. Maybe it is." As they drifted towards sleep, both felt a deep sense of gratitude for the unexpected path that had brought them together. Their marriage might not have begun with romantic love, but it had grown into something deeper and more sustaining than either had imagined possible. "Baby." As they drove home in their buggy, Rebecca felt a contentment so profound it was almost overwhelming. After years of uncertainty, as they drifted towards sleep, both exhausted by the drama and joy of the day, Rebecca felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. The desperate woman who had once begged for scraps had become a mother, surrounded by love and community and purpose. Samuel stirred in his cradle, making the soft sounds that newborns make, and both parents immediately turned toward him with the desperate beggar had become a beloved teacher, respected community leader, and devoted mother. But more than that, she had become living testimony to the power of love to transform lives, the importance of seeing potential in everyone, and the truth that our greatest gifts often emerge from our deepest struggles. Her story was far from over. In fact, with new opportunities for service and leadership opening before her, it felt like she was just beginning to understand the fullness of her purpose. But whatever the future held, she knew she would face it with the same courage and faith that had carried her from despair to joy, from the dirt road where she once lay dying, to the schoolhouse where she now shaped young minds, and the home where she was cherished beyond measure. 25 years had passed since that October morning when Rebecca collapsed by the Miller farmhouse mailbox, and the Pennsylvania countryside bore witness to a legacy that extended far beyond what anyone could have imagined. The one-room schoolhouse that had once served only the local district had become a model for Amish education throughout the state, with teachers traveling from distant communities to learn from the woman who had revolutionized how struggling children were taught and nurtured. Rebecca stood at the window of the expanded school building, watching her latest group of students play during their lunch break. At 54, her hair had turned completely silver, and her face bore the lines that came from decades of laughter, concern, and deep satisfaction. But her eyes remained bright with the passion that had driven her work for so many years, and her voice still carried the gentle authority that made even the most difficult children want to please her. Today was special. Not just another day in the rhythm of teaching that had shaped the past 2 decades of her life. Today marked her retirement from daily teaching, though she would continue to train new teachers and serve as a consultant for districts struggling with challenging educational situations. "Mrs. Miller," a familiar voice called from behind her. She turned to see Samuel, now 40 years old and a successful farmer in his own right, standing in the doorway with his own 6-year-old daughter in tow. "Papa." Little Anna Miller broke free from her father's hand and ran to Rebecca with the unself-conscious affection that grandchildren reserve for their most beloved grandparents. "Papa says today is your last day teaching. Does that mean you won't read us stories anymore?" Rebecca knelt to Anna's level, marveling at how the child's face combined features from both her son and his wife, but somehow managed to look exactly like Daniel had at that age. "Oh, sweetheart, I'll always read you stories. I just won't be teaching in the school every day. I'll have more time to spend with you and your cousins. Promise?" "I promise." Samuel approached with the measured gait he had inherited from his father, but his eyes held the warmth that made him beloved by his own children and the young people he mentored in the community. "The whole family's gathering at the farm this evening for your retirement celebration. Martha drove down from Ohio with her children, and Sarah's bringing her whole brood from Lancaster. Even Benjamin's coming in from Indiana. All my children home at once," Rebecca mused, feeling her heart swell with anticipation. "That hasn't happened in years. And Daniel's bringing that young woman he's been courting. Emma, Yorda, I think he might have an announcement to make." Rebecca smiled, thinking of her youngest son, now 29 and the last of her children to remain unmarried. Daniel had inherited his father's thoughtful nature and his mother's gift for seeing the best in everyone, qualities that had made him a successful blacksmith and a sought-after mediator in community disputes. "Emma's a lovely girl. She'll make him happy." As the afternoon wound down and Rebecca prepared for her final dismissal as the district's head teacher, she found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The desperate woman who had once begged for scraps had become one of the most respected educators in Pennsylvania's Amish communities, consulted by bishops, sought out by struggling families, and honored by her peers. But more than professional recognition, she had found something infinitely more precious: the deep satisfaction that came from knowing her life had meaning, that her struggles had prepared her to help others, that every experience, even the darkest ones, had contributed to her ability to serve. The retirement celebration that evening was everything Rebecca could have hoped for, and more. The Miller farmhouse, expanded over the years to accommodate their growing family, overflowed with children, grandchildren, neighbors, and friends. Tables groaned under the weight of traditional foods prepared by 3 generations of Miller women, and the yard echoed with laughter and conversation in both English and Pennsylvania Dutch. Ezra, now 73 but still vigorous, moved through the crowd with the quiet pride of a man who had watched his wife become everything he had always believed she could be. His hair was completely white now, and he walked with a slight stoop that spoke of decades of honest labor, but his eyes still lit up whenever they found Rebecca in the crowd. "Look at all this," he said, settling beside her on the front porch as the celebration continued around them. 5 children, 19 grandchildren, and more friends than we can count. Not bad for a couple of broken people who stumbled into each other's lives. 25 years, Rebecca mused, accepting the cup of cider he brought her. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, sometimes like a lifetime. Are you ready for retirement? Really ready? Rebecca considered the question as she watched her youngest grandson, Samuel's 3-year-old son David, attempt to catch fireflies in the gathering dusk. I'm ready to step back from daily teaching, yes, but I'm not ready to stop contributing. There's too much work still to be done. The teacher training program, that, and the counseling center we've talked about. I still get letters from families struggling with children who have learning difficulties, behavioral problems, family crises. There's so much need, Ezra, and you think you can address all of it single-handedly. Rebecca laughed, recognizing the gentle teasing in his voice. No, but I can train others to help. I can share what I've learned about reaching struggling children, supporting overwhelmed parents, building stronger communities. As the evening progressed, Rebecca found herself surrounded by a steady stream of well-wishers. Former students who had become teachers themselves, parents who credited her with saving their children's academic careers, community leaders who sought her counsel on matters far beyond education. But it was the quieter moments that touched her most deeply. Martha, her eldest daughter, pulling her aside to share news of her youngest son's acceptance to a prestigious apprenticeship program. Sarah, describing the reading difficulties her daughter was overcoming with techniques Rebecca had taught her. Benjamin showing her photographs of the innovative farming methods he was implementing in Indiana. You know, Martha said during one of these conversations, I used to think it was strange that you came to us from the English world. I couldn't understand why God would bring someone from such a different background into our community. And now I understand that God needed someone who remembered what it felt like to be an outsider, what it meant to struggle and overcome obstacles. You couldn't have helped so many children if you hadn't been through your own difficulties first. As the celebration began to wind down and families started the process of corralling tired children for the journey home, Daniel approached with Emma Yoda by his side, both of them glowing with barely contained excitement. Mama, Papa, Daniel said, his voice formal but his eyes dancing with joy. We have something to tell you. Rebecca felt her heart skip with anticipation. Yes, Emma and I are engaged. We'd like to be married in the spring if that's acceptable to both families. The announcement sparked a fresh round of celebration, with congratulations and embrace flowing freely. As Rebecca welcomed Emma into the family with genuine warmth, she marveled at how her youngest son had chosen a partner who shared his gentle nature and commitment to service. I'm so happy for you both, she told them, holding Emma's hands in her own. Daniel, you've chosen well. Emma, you're getting a man who will love you with his whole heart and support your dreams. Thank you, Mrs. Miller, Emma replied, her cheeks pink with emotion. I hope I can be half the wife and mother you've been. Just be yourself, sweetheart. That's all any of us can do. Later, after the last guests had departed and the house had returned to its peaceful quiet, Rebecca and Ezra sat together in their bedroom, helping each other prepare for bed, with the comfortable intimacy of a couple who had shared nearly 3 decades of marriage. So, Ezra said, brushing her silver hair with long, gentle strokes, what does retirement feel like? Like the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. I'm not done yet, Ezra. I still have work to do, gifts to share, people to help. I know, and I'll be right beside you, whatever comes next. Rebecca turned to face him, seeing in his lined face the same kindness that had first drawn her to him, the same steady strength that had supported her through every challenge and opportunity of their years together. Do you remember what you said to me that first day? About my place being in your house, not the dirt. I remember being harsh and judgmental. I've regretted those words many times. Don't regret them. They were exactly what I needed to hear, even if neither of us understood it at the time. How so? Rebecca rose and walked to the window that looked out over their farm, over the fields where their children had played, the barn where she had first shown her competence with animals, the lane where she had first collapsed in desperation, because my place was never in the dirt. As it was always here, in this life, with this family serving this community, but I had to go through the dirt to find it. I had to lose everything I thought I wanted in order to discover what I actually needed. And what was that? Purpose, love, the chance to use my struggles to help others overcome theirs. The opportunity to prove that no one is beyond redemption, that everyone has worth and potential. Ezra joined her at the window, his arms encircling her from behind, as they looked out together over the moonlit landscape that had been the backdrop for their extraordinary love story. 25 years ago, I was a bitter, isolated man who had given up on life. He said quietly, "You changed everything, Rebecca. You brought hope back to this place, love back to this house, purpose back to my existence. We changed each other. We saved each other." And Rebecca leaned back against his chest, feeling the solid warmth of his body and the steady rhythm of his breathing. Now we get to enjoy the fruits of what we built together. Children who are raising their own families with love and wisdom, a community that's stronger because of our contributions, a legacy that will continue long after we're gone. No regrets? None. Not even about the hardest parts, especially not about the hardest parts, because they taught me empathy, resilience, and the value of second chances. As they settled into bed together, Rebecca reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought her from desperation to fulfillment, from homelessness to becoming the center of a large, loving family, from begging for scraps to being honored as one of the most influential educators in their region. "Ezra," she said softly in the darkness, "I want you to know that every day of these 25 years has been a gift. Even the difficult days, even the times when we struggled or worried or faced challenges that seemed overwhelming, all of it has been worth it. Because of what we built together, because of who we became together, because of the love we found, the children we raised, the lives we were able to touch, because of the proof we became that redemption is possible, that broken people can heal, that love really can triumph over despair." "I love you, Rebecca Miller," Ezra whispered, pulling her close. "More than I loved you on our wedding day, more than I've ever loved anyone or anything. And I love you, Ezra Miller, my rescuer, my partner, my dearest friend. Thank you for seeing worth in a woman the world had given up on. Thank you for giving me a chance to become who I was meant to be." As sleep claimed them for what would be one of their last nights together, though neither knew it then, both felt a profound sense of completion and gratitude. They had written a love story that defied all expectations, built a life that served as testimony to the power of compassion and second chances. The desperate woman who had once been told her place was in the dirt had found her true place at last, not as a victim of circumstance, but as a victor over them, not as someone defined by her lowest moment, but as someone who had risen from that moment to heights she had never imagined possible. Her legacy would live on in the hundreds of children she had taught, the dozens of teachers she had trained, the countless families she had counseled and supported. But more than that, her story would continue to inspire anyone who heard it. Proof that no one is beyond hope, that every person has value and potential, and that sometimes the most broken people become the strongest once they're given the chance to heal and serve. 6 months later, Ezra passed peacefully in his sleep, his hand still holding Rebecca's after nearly 3 decades of marriage. At his funeral, the entire community gathered to honor a man who had been transformed from bitter isolation to generous service through the love of a woman who had taught him that broken hearts could heal and that hope could triumph over despair. Rebecca lived another 15 years, continuing her work with struggling children and overwhelmed families until her own peaceful passing at the age of 69. Her funeral drew people from 6 states, all of them touched in some way by the woman who had refused to let her circumstances define her worth. But her greatest legacy lived on in the Miller family farm, where her children and grandchildren continued to practice the lessons she had taught them, that everyone deserves compassion, that love can overcome any obstacle, and that the most meaningful life is one spent in service to others. The dirt road where she had once collapsed in desperation had become a place of pilgrimage for those who knew her story. A simple stone marker placed there by her children bore these words: "Here began a journey from despair to hope, from isolation to community, from brokenness to wholeness." Rebecca Nash Miller, teacher, mother, living proof that every soul has worth. And in the schoolhouse where she had spent 25 years shaping young minds, a plaque bore her favorite saying, words that had guided her work and defined her philosophy. "A child who struggles is not a child who fails, but a child who needs someone to believe in them until they can believe in themselves." The desperate beggar, who had once collapsed in the dirt, had indeed found her place, not in any physical location, but in the hearts of all those whose lives she had touched, whose potential she had recognized, whose worth she had affirmed when they couldn't see it themselves. Her place had never been in the dirt. It had always been in the light, reflecting it, sharing it, and helping others find their way to it. And in that light, her legacy would shine forever.